get out of this peculiar space in our heads where the Bible is the only place God speaks to us. That's a particularly Protestant way of thinking. Within the Roman Catholic tradition, it's largely the church. If you want answers to questions, you're going to get them from the priest. But the point is that God speaks in many different ways. So today we're finishing up the one on conscience. And I talked a little bit about what the conscience is, but we all have a sense of our own agency, whether you want to call it free will or whatever you want to call it. But we feel, and our parents remind us often when we're young, that we are responsible for what we do. And in the living out of that free will, we have goals that we seek to realize and maybe even get the idea in our head that we can make ourselves happy. And we don't know what happiness looks like, but we reach a point where we come into our own, so to speak, and we try to do things that will make us happy. And then there's this voice of conscience that slips into our mental life when we're about to do something and says, I got a character just popped into my head from Jurassic Park. Don't do that. What's the name of that character? He played on the Seinfeld show. That was it. And when we're young, our conscience largely comes from the people outside of us, our parents. And we will even feel guilty if we disobey them. Though, as I mentioned last week, in my experience, some people lose their childhood innocence very, very quickly, and other people hang on to it for a considerable season. Well, I think we're living in a generation where more and more young people are going to lose their innocence at a younger and younger age. And there's a lot of forces converging to make that happen. That can become difficult because as we get older, the conscience can become hardened, deadened, calloused. There's a Bible passage that talks about people whose consciences have been seared with a hot iron. And I think the idea is, men who work in coal, they work with hot materials, and they develop these calluses on their hands to where they can handle things that are extremely hot, and it doesn't bother them. And our consciences can become that way. After a while, things that used to scandalize us, don't bother us no more. And so that's a real thing that happens. But that's relevant to what I want to talk about today toward the end of this lesson. I'm picking up on page 28, where I talk about the moral history of the individual. Because the conscience has a very important role to play in our own spiritual development. If a person never tries to live up to their conscience, that is going to be very, very difficult for that person to grow spiritually. The living out of what we think a good and moral life is a very important part of our spiritual growth. Because out of that will come guilt and failure. Out of guilt and failure comes hope. And out of hope comes really a deeper basis for our religious beliefs than our reasoning. A lot of times in apologetics, we try to reason people into the Christian faith, or we have arguments about whether Jesus rose from the dead, or can we trust the Bible and stuff like that. Nothing wrong with any of that. That's what apologists do. But I think in truth, most people, if they ever do come to religious faith, come to it for deeply moral reasons. And those moral reasons arise out of their own life in the course of them living out their life. Many of us, if we did come to a religious faith, came to it at a very low point in our life where we had hit rock bottom. And we had nowhere else to turn. And the hope that maybe there is a God who could reach even us. And I think that's why C.S. Lewis does begin Mere Christianity with the moral argument, because I think he believed, certainly even in his own case, that his own moral history as an individual is where a lot of it came from. And that can be the danger of trying to cram religion down our children's throats at too early of an age. Because it might be well meant, and we want to get them baptized, and we want them to go to church, and we want them to know the Lord. But in truth, there's some things they're just going to have to do on their own before Christian faith becomes ripe. And they're ready to take that step. And it will be different for different people. I mean, if there's 1,000 kids at Vacation Bible School and they're all giving their life to Jesus on the same weekend, there's room for skepticism about what exactly is going on there. A lot of them are probably just doing what they see the other kids doing. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with Vacation Bible School or learning to love Jesus at Vacation Bible School, but it does mean, I think, that they may have to retread some of what they said back there at a later point in their life when they're ready for it. What do you think?
I think we've all done that.
You know, we have all done that.
Even those that came late.
Yeah. When I was growing up, we'd go to these youth camps, and they'd have these altar calls. And if you get saved at an altar call, I would say I've been saved several dozen times. There were some young people who didn't sweat easy when the pastor dialed up, the pressure. But that wasn't me. I was a very sensitive, tender type, and I got guilty real quick, and I would be up at that altar. I would just be, I'm no good. That was me. And then there were other kids sitting in the back like, I ain't going up there. They're like, you kidding me? He's going to have to try harder than that. But, there's a different people, different ways of responding. So that's why I call this the moral history of the individual. Because we think of morality so often as a set of rules. You either keep them or you break them. And we forget that, no, we develop a history. Well, you work in therapy. Anybody who goes to a therapist, I don't know, would you say you spend a good deal of your time going through their history? Most of the time. Okay, yeah. Because the question is, how did you get to the place where you're at? If I have a problem, I've probably spent years getting myself into that problem. And now, well, this might be the frustrating part about it. Now, I got to lose 100 pounds in a week. Like, well, that's not going to happen. You didn't gain 100 pounds in a week. You're going to lose 100 pounds in a week. This is going to take some time. So the moral history of the individual. At the bottom, I talk about the voice of guilt. And I do mention here, we don't talk too much about guilt anymore. But it does play a role. And the Bible is very clear in a number of passages that the conscience cannot be lived up to. And I think that that's important. Trying to live up to your conscience is like climbing a very difficult mountain only to get to the top and to see a whole new range of mountains even bigger than the one that you got through. In other words, the demands of our conscience, the more we try to meet them, the higher they get. And so we have this passage from Job. How then can a man be righteous before God? The important phrase there is before God. You can be righteous if you set your standards low enough. I can be righteous with my friend group, and I can be righteous in front of, my teacher maybe, or my parents, but how can a man be righteous before God? So the idea is that before God, the requirement is infinite. I will never get there. How can a man be righteous? How can one born of a woman be pure? If even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes, how much less a man who is but a maggot, a son of man who is only a worm. So this is not the sort of talk you hear too much anymore. Now, I mentioned here there's a couple senses of guilt. Well, on the one hand, it can refer to the feeling we get when we believe we violated a moral standard on some particular occasion. So that's one kind of guilt. If Dad says, don't take the candy from the counter, and we're just waiting for people to stop looking, we might sneak off with the candy. And we might feel a little guilty about it. But on the other hand, we can feel guilty in the sense of our whole life, top of page 29, falling short. And this is a boundless feeling. I call this infinite guilt because it's boundless. And there you can fall into some very, very deep depression. And it warrants close examination. In that sense, children aren't really capable of infinite guilt. They haven't lived long enough you have to have a sense of yourself before you can have a sense of that level of failure. So there are many people who have no experience of it, but that will depend in large measure as to how they are living their life. So if they're living their life only to live up to the standards of the society in which they find themselves, well, they're never going to have infinite guilt because the society's requirements are fairly finite, and you can live up to them and compare yourself to the person down the street and think you're doing all right. No great difficulty there. However, the inner voice that is always calling us to higher things. There are people who do try to live their lives according to that inner voice. The most famous one, of course, in Greco-Roman antiquity is Socrates, the great champion of conscience. I don't know. I don't think people read too much Socrates these days, but everybody's heard about him. Or at least if they saw Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, he's a funny character within that film. They stuff him in a time-traveling phone booth and take him to the mall, I believe. So, does it make sense to talk about requirements that extend beyond our finite capacities? Well, only if mankind was ultimately made to depend upon God. So you might say, well, why should a person strive infinitely to the point where they experience that level of failure and guilt? What's the value of that? The value of it, though, is that is how a person discovers their need for God. That is how a person discovers their need for God, and our need for God is something we do have to discover. Our parents can tell us about it. They can come say, you know you need the Lord. But it's not going to mean anything to us unless we ourselves find it out for ourselves, and that is where we come to that. That's probably why in the Bible we have this idea of sin. And sin is its own concept. It doesn't just mean a little bit of a moral slip-up. Sin is this idea that we are somehow in a condition that we've been born into, and that we only discover through repeated failure. And the more profound the individual is, the more profoundly they discover their own sin. And often the more profoundly religious they become. We all have heard the story of Martin Luther and his mighty wrestling with the problem of sin. It's no accident that he became such a powerful religious figure in his time. So before I go on to the voice of hope, I want to stop there and see if there's any question or comment about this idea of the moral history of the individual, the living out of one's conscience, and the discovery of our own bankruptcy. Our own moral bankruptcy is basically what it comes down to.
Does the Bible teach us that it seems like it talks about like that we have the capacity to harden our own heart, and then eventually, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the guy that Moses was throwing the snakes at and everything.
Pharaoh?
Pharaoh.
Yeah.
So the first couple times, Pharaoh's hardening his own heart, and then in the end, God hardens his heart, right?
Yes.
So, I don't know, just my own walk, I've noticed that when you talk about guilt, it's like you can do something you feel guilty about. You feel real guilty the first time. Second time, a little less. Third time, not so much. Fourth time, not a big deal.
Fifth time, you're wondering why you ever thought it was wrong in the first place.
So it's like, I think your heart, right? That would be like an example of hardening our heart.
Yeah.
And that's when it is scary, when you no longer feel that guilt.
So that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a good illustration, of what I was talking about earlier when I talked about a conscience seared as with a hot iron. Men who handle hot materials in coal mines and things like that, they develop these calluses to where they can handle stuff that is extremely hot and it doesn't bother them, and our consciences become that way. Pharaoh is a very good example of that from the Exodus story. There's as many passages that say he hardened his own heart as there are ones that say God hardened it. And so sometimes we do too much logic chopping. We try to figure out, well, which is it? But of course, it's both. There's a dynamic. As God leaves us to our own devices, that is his way of punishing us, really. Because if we are rebellious enough, and then he lets us go our own way, well, anybody who's raised kids knows that that's one of the most effective ways to punish a child is to say, you know what? Okay, you don't want to take showers or wash your clothes? Fine. After about a week of that, and they're living in this stink hole, then they maybe come around. That's a trivial example. But you're right, in the moral history of the individual, we also saw this in the little book by Viktor Frankl about the effect of the concentration camp on the human conscience, that people over time were so hardened that the atrocities that they did without any feeling of guilt. So it doesn't happen overnight. And that's one of the reasons why it's a warning to us, I guess, as Christians, that in our own living out, we have to be careful.
So back to Pharaoh,
Yeah.
God had not hardened his heart. Would we think that Pharaoh may have made better decisions? And God tried to make worse decisions? Or how do I understand?
Yeah, that's a good question. Back to the Pharaoh thing. A little bit of speculation there. I think, though, The Bible never really presents Pharaoh as being a good guy in the first place. I don't get the impression that Ramesses was a pretty good guy until God started hardening his heart. You get the idea that he repeatedly hardened his heart. And maybe a way of thinking about it is God brought out the worst in him. But he didn't bring out anything that wasn't there in the first place.
Pharaoh probably still would have done the wrong thing.
He still would have done the wrong thing. Sometimes when I'm in a humorous mood, I think God is behaving sometimes like a younger brother behaves toward an older. Let's say there's an older brother who already has a temper, and the younger one knows it. He'll prod him a little bit, try to get him stirred up. Now, he's not bringing anything out of the older brother that isn't there. That's why the younger brother does it, because he knows he can get away with it and then blame, well, I didn't do it, he did that, you see. It's entirely, God seems to be doing that. He seems to be deliberately provoking Pharaoh. And the irony is that as he provokes Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gets harder and harder and more radical, it enables God to show forth his salvation that much greater. At the end, he plays Pharaoh throughout that story. I'm not a strict Calvinist in my theology, but the Calvinist idea that God is well within his rights to play people and get them to play into his plan, I think is entirely legitimate.
So he thinks he's defying God, but God is actually kind of using all of that, using him in a sense?
I think in that story at least, God is definitely using Pharaoh and manipulating him. Now, I don't believe that God does that with anybody and everybody just for his divine pleasure, but in that particular story, he is going to show to the whole world, to Egypt and Israel, who he is. And he's also going to show the whole world that Pharaoh is not God, even though he makes divine claims about himself. You know.
You talked about how you're amazed when you think about Egypt, the length of the empire, how great it was and so on.
Oh,
So that's a huge stage on which God is showing us. We kind of think to do about that.
yeah, certainly for the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, whenever the Exodus happened, that is the stage. Egypt is hands down considered the highest expression of human achievement on planet Earth. Now, that would change in the centuries to come. These days, we think of Egypt as a little backward. But at the time, yeah, that was the apex of human civilization. And it would make sense for God to select for his people a group of slaves, nobodies. It's just another biblical expression for him bringing something out of nothing, or sometimes calling the things that are as though they're not. And we see that all throughout the Bible. When God wants a child to be born, he seems to have a preference for barren women. When he wants to bring forth the fruit of the earth, he chooses deserts. The poets will say he'll make a garden in the desert. So there's this ongoing theme that in order to display his greatness, Yahweh chooses the things that are not. And he brings the Magnificat, Mary's song. He brings down the proud, and he raises up the lowly.
So he's more than just Savior, he's also showing himself as creator in a sense there, or recreator?
Yeah, creator, recreator. Absolutely. He shows his divine power. Yeah, I see all of that going on in the Exodus story. So I think it's a good example of how the conscience does kind of degenerate, and also how God himself become involved in that process. Almost just by leaving us to our own devices. Well, on page 29, the next section is called The Voice of Hope. We can never live up to the demands of our conscience. We can live up to the demands of our parents or our church or our society or other external rules. But the conscience is not an external rule. It always demands more. I mentioned here the Greek myth of Sisyphus. You might not recognize the name, but many of you have at least heard the story of the man who was condemned to hell to repeatedly push a large boulder up a hill, and every time come rolling back down. And in some of these myths, particularly in Virgil, there's poetical punishments for people that show forth whatever their vice was. And this is the myth of Sisyphus is a story about futility, working hard over and over and over at something just to have your labors unravel. Anybody ever felt like that in some capacity in their life? That, why do I do it, you know? Certainly kids get an early glimpse into it when they make their beds. The bed is always like, I make this bed over and over and over again. Why do I do it? Because I'm just going to mess it up anyways. So you pull your little one aside and say, have you heard of the myth of Sisyphus? No, that's not typically what a parent does. Unless, of course, I probably did that to my kids. Albert Camus, a French philosopher, wrote an essay about that. But other thinkers, too, top of page 30, have talked about problem of futility, the feeling of futility. The book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament deals with that at great length. Meaningless. Why do we do it? The sun goes on its little circle, and we run around. TJ, when he was young, he might still do it, used to like to look at ants. Anybody ever look at ant hills when they were little? And from this sort of God perspective, you look at these ants running around, and you think, how silly. They don't even know what they're doing down there. They're just running around in circles. But I imagine when God looks down at us, that's probably about how we look. It's like just running around in circles. They get in the car, they go in a circle, they go back, go to bed, get up, and do it all over again. But if we do believe that our moral lives matter, and that the decisions that we make matter, then in spite of the fact that we can never live up to the demands of our conscience, a person can either despair, in which case they give up all hope and they stop trying, and that can take people down some pretty dark paths. But it is a very real thing. Or the hope that somehow the power that lurks behind their conscience will vindicate itself in their life. So I mentioned these two paths. If a man chooses despair, he asserts that all his moral striving is meaningless. He decides that the whole business is a chasing after the wind, and there's any number of ways that can express itself. Suicide, of course, is the most energetic way of ending things. Returning to hedonism, which means chasing pleasures, but at this stage, you're not chasing them innocently the way a young child would. It's more like vinegar in the wound of life. You're trying to deaden yourself to the pain of your own existence by finding things that are pleasurable. I mentioned Quixotic moral heroism. That reminds me of some highly moral philosophers. At least they led moral lifestyles, even though they said that it was all meaningless. So I call it Quixotic. If you've read Don Quixote is the sort of patron saint of lost causes. But if we remain faithful to the voice of our conscience, this is the last paragraph, we'll see if there's any comment about it. What we will despair of is our own ability, and we'll put our hope in divine providence. Divine providence, the idea that there is a God who will make good what we cannot. And to believe that it is possible with His help for the demands of our conscience to be met. And in this way, the individual is built up to the task of moral living. That's what we call upbuilding, or an older word for upbuilding is edification. It's a good deal of what pastors do when they deliver sermons, or what you do when you try to encourage other people. You try to build them up, to edify them, to help them to see that their moral striving is not meaningless, and that it's worth it. And this is not yet faith, but it is a hope that leads to faith. And many of the great moral leaders and philosophers and saints throughout history are people like this. They may be Christian. They may not always be Christian, though. They may just be very, very moral individuals who believe that the moral life of striving is what all of us are supposed to do, and that somehow God in His time and in His providence will make it good, will bring the absolute good about, because it cannot depend on us as human beings. We are not going to achieve it. Certainly not through the help of government programs or anything like that, that we're going to create some sort of utopia here on earth. That just goes to show you, if people reject religion, they'll believe well nigh anything. The idea that we as human beings are going to bring about a perfect world is the height of stupidity. I just don't see how that's ever going to happen. So, I don't actually, in that lesson, the voice of conscience, end with a specifically Christian answer to that issue. I just raised the issue and tried to show how it develops, because it's one of the voices through which God speaks. Any thoughts about that or comments about that? I remembered to bring my water bottle today. Well, when you meet different people, you meet people who, I think everybody listens, everybody hears the voice of conscience. Everybody hears it. You'll find, especially with older people, that conversation has taken their lives in different directions. And you might even think of your own life. What direction has it taken me? I can talk about my own life when it comes to the role that conscience has played, but there's as many different stories in this room as there are people. I'm looking out at you, and wouldn't it be great if I could just read your mind right now? No, we don't want that. But you all have the God-given privilege to read your own mind. So that's one thing that you can do. Though sometimes, I suppose, we're even mysteries to our own selves. We don't always, we look into our inner lives and think, goodness gracious, what's going on in there?
I'm amazed at how well I can lie to myself.
Oh, yeah, that is true.
That's scary.
We are very, very good at deceiving ourselves. Actually, I discovered the secret to that rather too late in life. I was always a terrible liar. I would try to lie, to get out of difficulties or things, but I was just awful at it. Anybody know anybody like that? They're just, it's like people who can't sing or hold pitch. It's just not in the cards. They're not good liars. And I discovered, the best liars always remember to lie themselves first. That's why they're so good at it. Because they're not even trying to deceive you. You are just caught up in their own self-lie. And I've never been very good at that. Whenever I'm doing something that I know I shouldn't be doing, I just know it. I know everything. And so I've not been very good at that. But I have met some people that are very, very good at it. It's scary good, yeah. Yeah.
David in the Psalms asked God to search him and know him.
Yes.
And of course, in the New Testament, the word light is used all the time about, in Ephesians, for example, it talks about walking in the light.
Yeah.
John.
So that's a good passage from the Psalms. Search me and know me is a very deliberate entering into this voice of conscience. Placing yourself before God and in God's presence, in your prayer time, searching your heart before Him, having Him search your heart, and asking Him to find if there is an offensive way in you. Which shows that it's very proactive in that. And then you're quite right, in the New Testament, the metaphor of light shining in the darkness, searching out the hidden places, is the language that is used. And I would say it very close to practically identifying Jesus with the voice of conscience. Because there's that passage from John that says the light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. That's a striking passage because the idea is that all human beings have light to some extent. But that passage is saying the light that lights every man came into the world when Jesus came into the world. I always thought, I've mulled over that passage many, many times. A very striking passage from the Gospel of John, where he does, where Jesus explicitly says he's the light of the whole world. He identifies himself with the light. Very, very striking passage. So just a quick review, and I'll get a foot in the door on this next lesson. I had kind of a general introduction. We talked about, in the last two lessons from God Speaks, the voice of reason. So that was one. And then the voice of conscience, we've just finished, is another. And I thought appropriate would be the voice of longing, because longing is feeling or desire or yearning. And that's a typical triad for philosophically minded people. You have your truth, your goodness, and your beauty. Your reason is what you use to ferret out the truth, and your conscience to pursue that which is good. And beauty, unless I'm mistaken, we all have a longing for things that are pleasant and beautiful. And those two things are not precisely identical, but they do have a close connection with one another. So I mentioned here, we've talked about God's goodness, but what about beauty? And beauty attracts us in a way differently than the conscience does. The conscience is a harsh master. It's the crack of the whip. It's the thou shalt not. It's the voice of disapproval. And so that's a hard road to travel. But that's not the only voice that draws us to God. And I use here is appropriate to use the word to draw. Beauty draws us freely toward itself. We even use that expression when someone says of someone else that they are attractive. We use that expression, but we don't often think about it. What does it mean? Other people are attracted to them. They freely go toward those people, either because in the body they are beautiful, and that's a kind of immediate attraction. You get in trouble for it, but it was funny. I was at Ocean City, not this last year, 2 years ago. We were out on the beach, and there's a woman sitting next to her husband, and there was on the beach, so people are hardly dressed. A very beautiful woman goes walking by wearing not a whole lot of clothes, and the woman's husband, his face just kind of followed her down the beach. I don't even think he realized that he did it. And of course, his wife smacked him, and he snapped out of it. And then, but she attracted him. He saw her, and he just kind of just like a robot, like that. And I had the joy of laughing at it in the background. I thought, oh, that was so funny. But it's a thing that happens. But there's different kinds of beauty. So that's one kind of beauty. So God speaks to us through reason, through our conscience, but also through the longings of the heart, the desires of the heart. And Plotinus, great Greek philosopher, says, the soul in its nature loves God and longs to be at one with him, as in the noble love of a daughter for a father. St. Augustine, very famous quote, God has made us for himself. We are restless till we rest in him. That's from the opening prayer of the Confessions. And the idea is that the human soul and body have different needs, and those needs correspond to different desires. We need food, but there's a desire for food. And that creates a problem that all of us have. I certainly have it, which is that rationally I eat in order to repair my body and to provide myself with the nutrients that I need. But that's not really why I do most of my eating activity. I desire food, and I enjoy eating it. And so sometimes I have far in abundance of anything. Those candies over there on the... See, this is a human creation. I'm going to grab one of these. These are not very good candies, but this has absolutely no nutritional value. And yet people are going to eat this up because it tastes good. And so as human beings, we've manufactured products that we consume just for the enjoyment of consuming them, even though not only do they have no nutritional value, they're probably bad for you. Smoking. Many people love to smoke. I used to smoke a pipe, loved smoking a pipe. It wasn't good for me, but I could sit out by the lake back when I was in college with a book and get a nice little cloud hovering around my head like I was Gandalf or something, just sitting there puffing away. I miss it. But was it good for me? No, it wasn't good for me at all. The whole religious tradition asserts that there exists, alongside other basic needs, we have desire for food, we have a desire for sex. Those are our basic animal desires. We have a desire for companionship, loneliness, and a desire for companionship. All of these are things that we have desires for, and there is also then going to be a natural longing for God. the desire to see God is often a metaphor of expression for it. Moses says, "Let me behold your presence." And he actually literally, he says, "Let me see your face." Now that's difficult to know how to translate. Well, you can just leave it as is. And Yahweh, of course, says, sorry, not going to happen. The old Latin expression for it is the visio beatifica, the beatific vision. The vision of that which is beautiful, that which is fully satisfying. The earliest statement I mention is in the mouth of Moses in the Bible, Exodus chapter 33. The request is denied, presumably because Moses is sinful, Yahweh is holy, and as we learn in the Old Testament, anybody who comes into close contact with him doesn't live to tell the story. I don't know if you've noticed that. The first day of public worship in the book of Leviticus, 2 of Aaron's sons go running into the sanctuary and get zapped. Boom, they're gone. And people are told not to approach too close. And it isn't because Yahweh is bad, but because his fiery presence destroys all that is contrary to it, which is why, if you think about it, the story of the burning bush, the bush is not harmed. Why is Yahweh seem to be harmful to people, but not to trees? Well, the tree is not sinful. It's pure. And we may get something profound out of that when in the New Testament the fiery presence descends upon the apostles and they are not harmed on the day of Pentecost. That within the Jewish framework is a very big deal. How is it possible for Yahweh to dwell in a human being and not destroy him? Something very, very profound going on. Now, we can discuss how the vision happened and how literal the story is and what exactly happened in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. But it's clear that the point the author is trying to get across to us is that on that day, the believers in Jesus Christ became the temple, the dwelling place of Yahweh's presence. New Temple, evangelical. That would be a good name for a church. The Bible does say, even in the Old Testament, we have a capacity to enjoy a partial expression of the divine in the present life, and holds out the hope of a fuller expression in the life to come. This from 1 Corinthians. Paul, now we see but a poor reflection, as in a mirror, then we shall see him face to face. And Paul is expressing the idea that there awaits us at the end of the present life a union with God that will be blissful beyond anything we know. And nobody knows what that will be or what it will look like, but that's where we get the language of eternal bliss. And then we can get into, I don't know what heaven's going to be like, in all honesty. I have no idea, except we're told that it will be a happiness unlike any we've ever known. And that's nice. I think sometimes as Christians we need to be reminded of that, because life down here on earth can seem not always very happy. A lot of pain, a lot of difficulty, a lot of discouragement. And the hope of heaven is something we need to be reminded of. And that's why sometimes when I'm on the piano at church, I like some of those old toe-tapping songs about going to heaven. Now, I know that they can seem corny, but there's something in me that likes them. And they're very, very cheerful. And I like that. Very, very cheerful. Now, let me stop and see if there's any questions about that. And then I'm going to say a little bit by way of anticipation, because this will be the most, we'll get into much of this next week. A very important distinction, and C.S. Lewis makes it, the difference between a natural longing for God and an artificial one. So, a natural longing is one that you're born with and that belongs to you natively as a human being. And so Plotinus was saying all people desire for union with God. What would an example of an unnatural or an artificial longing be? Would be a child's desire to meet Santa Claus. You're not born with the desire to see Santa Claus because he doesn't. How old are the kids in here? I've gotten in trouble for that before as a teacher. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but Santa Claus is a fiction. He doesn't really exist. And you can't actually want to see him until you've been deceived into believing that he exists. And then you can fantasize about meeting him. But the idea, particularly in C.S. Lewis, he focuses on it more than any other modern theologian I can think of, that this is a very natural desire. And C.S. Lewis actually prefers it. He prefers that approach. It fits his literary style. Artistically inclined people. Maybe the best way to think of it in religious language are the mystics. Mystically inclined people. Some theologians are very intellectual. I think of St. Thomas Aquinas, very intellectual in his approach to God. If you think of somebody like St. Francis of Assisi, he loves God, but you don't think of him as hashing out arguments for God's existence. I just kind of imagine him walking with the animals in the glen and just loving the beauty of everything. So many of the great mystics throughout the centuries, like John of the Cross or St. Teresa, within the Reformed tradition, John Owen, even Jonathan Edwards, certainly parts of Martin Luther's writings, Meister Eckhart in Germany, Thomas à Kempis, who wrote The Imitation of Christ. Mystics are people who are fired by a love for God and by a desire for closeness with God. Now, their writings become controversial because in describing their pursuit and their love of God, they take over the language of eroticism. Song of Songs is their favorite book. And, within Christian circles, it's that book in the Bible that we're like, how did this get in here? But for the mystics, it's their favorite book. And it's not because for them they read it sexually, but they read it, the sexual language in it as a metaphor for the longing of the human heart for a union with God. Anybody in here ever read any mystical literature? It's not easy to read. I've read a healthy chunk of it, and it's powerful. Very powerful. It's not always easy to know what to do with. That's true of mystical people in literature in general. So, next week, we're going to talk about the voice of natural longing, and then the second section in this lesson is supernatural longing. But the highest expression of natural longing, which we'll get to next week, is the sublime. And we don't use that word very much anymore. But we'll talk a little bit about it. And so thank you very much.